Today we're going to be going over some tips on how to make your game run as efficiently as possible. First, it's going to be a two-part series, the first part of which is going to be covering rendering, and the second of which is going to be more of a coding technical side. And the first tip, and this is one of the more important ones because as you start building your scene, especially in open world, you'll start to notice that your frames are dropping and at one point it might become unplayable. Now, there's an option that I learned later on when I first started on that is quite useful, especially in the 3D world, is the static option up here. So when we're in runtime in the game and we can move this around because it's not a static object. Unity is also costing more frames to calculate it moving. Um, Now, if we check it off as the static, this can't move. So when we press play, it shouldn't move. It won't move at all. It's a static object inside our game, and it can't and won't move. It's locked in place. Um, Normally, you want to do this with every object that doesn't move. So when we say don't move, I'm talking more of it shouldn't animate or it shouldn't have any type of coding that changes its transform. Usually, you'd use this with stuff like buildings and props that aren't meant to move, like a statue, for example, is another one. And what it does is it saves you some frames. And if we look into the options here, there's a whole bunch of other static options that I'm going to go through and explain how they will help you lower your rendering costs. So the first one I already have the tab open is occlusion. You can find it in the window tab inside rendering. It should be occlusion culling. What this does is it calculates your camera's visibility lines, and it doesn't render anything that the camera doesn't see. So I'm going to create an example here. So going to the object, we have no occlusion areas right here. Sorry, so I'm just going to create one. There we go. And this little box should appear. Now, normally when you have this little box, you want to make it expand the size of your scene and size of the static objects. It is good to note that these things only calculate when you bake it, just like the nav mesh on static objects only. And there's also lighting that only calculates on static options. We're going to go through that in a moment here. So I have an area selected here, and I'm just going to bake it. And it's going to calculate little squares of visibility that it'll automatically do for you. The bigger you see, the longer it takes, but it normally doesn't take long. So I'm going to show you what happens when we press play on here. And then we're going to visualize it based off our camera. Here, visualize visibility lines. So this is what I wanted to show you is normally at runtime when you have a bunch of objects, I don't have a bunch of objects now, um, whatever these lines hit these cubes here, it'll cut off. So we notice here that we have the cubes outlined in the box, but we actually can't see it. This is the work of the occlusion culling. So it's not within the camera's visibility. It's not going to render. And you can also notice if you click camera volumes, you can see the squares that are activated based on the occlusion area. So only this small little region here is going to be rendered. The rest outside here wouldn't be, for example. Next, we're going to cover lighting, and this one is pretty short and pretty simple. It also applies to being static. So when you look at your cube here, under static, contribute GI, so that's global illumination. Now, normally with your lights, for the best visual experience, you would keep it at real time. So it'll calculate every type of lighting at real time. You don't have to create any light maps or anything like that. Most people stick with mix because then they can bake some light maps into the static options. But there's also baked as well. I wouldn't really recommend this unless your like sun, for example, is static. So it doesn't if you don't have a day or night cycle or something like that, then maybe do baked. Other than that, just stick with mixed. And what you want to do is go into your rendering lighting, strike it over here, and we just generate lighting, and it would just create the calculations and create pictures for the light maps to render off of instead of calculating the sun constantly, which the bigger you're seeing, the more it'll cost. as well. So for GI cache, we want to go into our preferences. And over here, you notice that it says clean cache. This is how much our light maps, this is temporary files. This is how much our light maps has accumulated over the time. This is just one simple bake, so it's not that big. And this is how much your maximum size that you would actually store this, so you don't overdo it. Normally, if your light maps don't work, or if it's aborted halfway through, this is the cause of it. Not enough space. So every now and then you just want to clean it, and that's it. Next, we're going to move over to Blender, where I'll show you how to lower the vertices in an object. I have this as an example, and I'm going to have to cut because it does have millions of vertices to when it stops. So what we want to do is go into edit mode, into our object here, and select everything. And Blender has an option that cuts off useless vertices, and sometimes it goes a little beyond that, but that's what the calculation is for. So we go into our modifiers and we choose decimate, and we just change the ratio. So I'm going to do something like 0.2, and I'll be right back when it's done doing its thing. So you have to do your decimate in object mode, and I've already done it a couple of times to knock it down. If you notice that it's starting to make your model look less quality, that's when I'd say you'd stop and maybe revert it a little bit. But if you look here, I got a lot less vertices for Unity to render. It's going to save me a ton of frames. And that's it. That's it for the rendering aspect of tips. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And if you're stuck on anything that you need help with, definitely ask it down below. Especially if it's something not covered, I'll try my best to help you figure it out. Thank you for watching.